We're going to get moving along with our next speaker, Ken Gerhard. He's a good buddy of mine, widely recognized cryptozoologist. Okay, we're going to stretch a little bit. I'm going to get his PowerPoint up here and ready, though. I've had the honor of knowing and being friends with Ken for over a decade at this point. As I mentioned, not only is my fascination in many of these other subjects and strange creatures, he is a world traveler who's been to many countries in search of these mysterious beasts, these unknown animals, which many people, of course, are very opinionated about and have different outlooks on and cultural views. And I think that's important to consider because cryptozoology is something that is, of course, fascinating to a lot of people because Bigfoot, of course, is the sort of icon of this whole field. But there are many strange creatures, and we're discovering new species every day. That's something I think that not only has Ken been involved with for a great deal of his research, in the Bigfoot area, but it's also something I think, lends credence to the notion that there are creatures out there that we are discovering. They're not necessarily new creatures, but they are new to our sciences. And so I think this area of cryptozoology is really sort of a subfield of normal, regular zoology, which is all about animals, wildlife, animal science, and understanding about speciation and all the different types of species. And maybe that some of these unknown creatures could be misidentifications of known species or offshoots of something. It's a really interesting subject, so I highly encourage, if you're familiar with any of these, to share about some of these with people here, talk with Ken about, the things and work that he's done, because he's, again, someone who not only has appeared on many shows, but has a great basic knowledge about the reports, the history, the people, the locations. All of these things which we do with UFOs is a very similar process in the way of investigating claims and accounts and all of this history. I think it's fascinating. I had the honor and privilege of joining him on an expedition we went into in the summer of last year. We went out to Bluff Creek, California. If I say Bluff Creek, or I say Frame 352, or the Patterson-Gimlin film, how many of you know what I'm talking about? Not a lot. Well, I wouldn't expect a lot at a UFO conference, but if anyone knows the picture of this thing doing that right there, you might know what I'm talking about. Patty, the Patterson-Gimlin film is that iconic Bigfoot film from 1967. We went to the location. And we were there for a completely different reason, but we were on an expedition in search of salamanders, which was just a joyous adventure. Beautiful place. Ken's traveled the world in search of evidence for mysterious creatures, including Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, the Chupacabra Mothman, Beast of Zebedon. In addition, he's written 6 books on the subject of unknown animals, and his research has been featured on numerous TV shows, including Missing in Alaska, Monster Quest, Ancient Aliens, America Unearthed, and The Unexplained, and Legend Hunters. You guys have probably seen him on quite a few different shows and networks. He's appeared on several of them, including the Travel Channel, Science Channel, National Geographic, and Animal Planet. And he's currently been seen on History Channel series The Proof is Out There. So this is a really cool opportunity because, and I've been excited about this topic and this specific cryptid for some time, but to be here in South Texas and to know that we're going to be discussing the legend of what we refer to as Big Bird is really exciting. So I hope you guys think about this in a way that UFOs are not always alien spaceships, or they're not always flying saucers. Sometimes an unidentified flying object might be an animal that we don't know what it is. We can't really readily figure it out. It's unidentified. So we're going to be talking about maybe some unidentified flying animals, some interesting ideas about what's going on with this strange creature. So without any further ado, I'm honored to welcome my good friend and colleague, Ken Gerhard. Give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Daniel. It's always an honor and a pleasure to work with you, my friend. Yeah, so it's an honor certainly to be here at the 10th Edinburg Out of This World UFO Festival and Conference. Live right up the road in San Antonio, so it was a pleasant drive down here, and I have spent a lot of time in the valley through the years doing research, primarily on this guy. And Daniel kind of stole my thunder a little bit, but if you guys remember the line from Monty Python's Flying Circus, and now for something completely different. Maybe it's not that different, but I am going to talk about something unidentified, something that was flying, and something that was an object or an animal, maybe more specifically. I am, of course, curious about all types of unexplained mysteries. I find the UFO phenomenon fascinating. Ghosts, I have friends who are ghost hunters and paranormal, and all that stuff is fascinating to me. But as Daniel said, I'm primarily a cryptozoologist, which means that I investigate and search for evidence of undescribed species, which, so I look at things through the prism of zoology and science. I'm curious how many of you folks, particularly you old-timers, remember the Big Bird or have heard about the Big Bird. Okay, so you guys should be pretty proud. This is a pretty big deal. It's been a number of years, but Big Bird became so famous back in 1976, it was picked up by news wires all over the world. It made headlines in Germany, Japan, and so it's definitely an integral part of the culture of the unexplained in this part of Texas. I should point out that the name is a bit of a misnomer, of course. Many of the names of our cryptids, and if you guys are familiar with cryptozoology, we refer to the subject matter, Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, Chupacabra, are all called cryptids. And a lot of the names of our cryptids were actually invented by the media. So, Abominable Snowman, Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, Mothman, these are all names that were invented by reporters. They don't necessarily describe what people were seeing, but they're just kind of fun to talk about. But even though the name Big Bird, and yes, this was in the 70s, so this was probably a reference to Sesame Street character that's very popular at that time. But what people were describing did have wings. It did appear to be animate or alive, but it wasn't necessarily a bird. And if you guys are familiar with the basic tenets of zoology, the main characteristics of all bird species are they're covered in feathers, they lay eggs, their morphology is interesting, their bodies are filled with a series of air sacs, they're very aerodynamic, so there are a lot of defining characteristics of quote-unquote birds. And we'll talk about some birds here at the end of the lecture that may or may not be responsible for some of the sightings. But anyways, this is my first book, written in 2007. I was here in the Rio Grande Valley about 20 years ago doing research on this particular topic. One thing I wanted to start out with, though, because one of the most common questions that I get as a cryptozoologist from people of all types of interests is there a connection between Bigfoot and UFOs? Everyone always asks me that, or what I think about that theory. And we have to acknowledge that all people have different types of biases based on our upbringing, our family, our religious beliefs. And most of the people that ask me if Bigfoot is connected to UFOs are people that are already interested in UFOs, and they want to I think it's more of a cultural thing where people want to connect the dots, so to speak. And in fact, there's a human condition or a psychological condition called apophenia, whereby people, sometimes unconsciously, we want to connect things that are unconnected, but in our minds it kind of makes sense. So obviously, Bigfoot is a great mystery, UFOs are a great mystery, and in some people's minds it's like, wow, it'd be cool if those two things were connected somehow. What I can tell you is that there's a misconception about how often these really weird Bigfoot cases where there are UFOs seen or glowing lights and all types of things that might be related to UFOs. But a recent sample size, and there have been thousands of Bigfoot sightings that have been documented, but statistically only about 3% of Bigfoot sightings describe anything really weird or otherworldly. So as much as it would be fun to connect those, and guys, I'm just going to tell you, I'm a speculator. I'm not an expert in anything, so I'm just going to be giving you guys supposition and speculation. But if you look at the evidence and the data, and that's how I approach things, I'm an evidence data kind of guy, only 3% of Bigfoot sightings indicate anything other than just a big hairy animal that's very elusive running around up there. So, you can certainly someone could make an argument. I'm not going to make that argument. I don't think there's a connection between Bigfoot and UFOs. There are some weird cases out there, but in my own opinion, 3% doesn't really move the needle in that direction for me personally. Okay, so this is an eyewitness sketch. This is kind of how I first became interested in Big Bird 20 or so years ago. I already knew about the Big Bird. I was living in Houston at the time, and you know, I was already well schooled in different cryptozoological cases. But in 2003, I had a friend who we went out looking for Bigfoot evidence together in East Texas, and he was on a job site in Houston. He was an electrician at the time, and he was talking about Bigfoot to some of his coworkers and his interest in Bigfoot. And one of his coworkers, a gentleman named Richard Guzman, said, I don't know anything about Bigfoot, but I saw like a flying dinosaur one time that looked like, you know, like out of the Flintstones cartoon, you know, flying around. Well, my friend, who has a colorful name of Bam Bam, actually recognized that as, well, there should not be any prehistoric flying reptiles flying around in Texas. And so he brought the gentleman over to meet me one day, and we had an interview, and he did this sketch for me of what he saw. And he claimed he had this sighting back in 1983 in Pasadena, Texas, which is just east of Houston. He and a friend were out sitting, when they were teenagers, sitting out leaning on his car, and this thing flew over their head, and they both just looked at each other and were like, "Did you just see that?" And he said it was a golden tannish brown in color. Now, it wasn't real huge. He said it only had a wingspan of about maybe 5 or 6 feet across. But what he remembered specifically is that it had a crest. It didn't have any feathers. It had it was covered in skin, and it had this kind of crest-shaped object on its head, and it had a long tail like this with a diamond shape on the end. Now that is diagnostic because if any of you guys know anything about paleontology, long before the pterodactyls evolved, you know, back during the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, during the Triassic period, about 300 million years ago, there were a bunch of small pterosaurs all over the earth, flying reptiles, and they all had this long tail. They were called rhamphorhynchoids. They had a long tail with a flange shape on the end. So that's interesting. So what I thought of when Richard Guzman gave me this account from 1983 is I remembered reading a case from the same year, 1983, that occurred in the Rio Grande Valley near Los Fresnos, if you guys know where Los Fresnos is, but okay. So this was a newspaper article that appeared possibly in the Brownsville Herald or a local newspaper. But this gentleman, James Thompson, was an ambulance driver, emergency medical services in Harlingen, and he was driving on Highway 100, just east of Los Fresnos, when he claimed that a mystery bird flew in front of his ambulance. And he actually described the mystery bird as having, you know, no feathers, leathery bat-like wings, and a long tail with a flange shape on the end. And it said it almost hit the hood of his ambulance as he was driving, and he was like, whoa, you know, and he stopped it, got up and watched this thing sail away. And so he went and, you know, reported it, and it was picked up by the local news services here in the valley. And but this was actually after the fact, because most of the big bird cases we're going to talk about here in a moment happened in 1976. That was the big year here for the big bird. So this was a few years after all that. And again, he said it wasn't huge, had like maybe a 6-foot wingspan, but he described it as a mystery bird. But certainly birds have feathers, and this did not. This is the location where James Thompson had his sighting of his quote-unquote mystery bird, Highway 100, just east of Los Fresnos. And I took this photo again about 20 years ago when I was down here doing an investigation. Actually, one of the last times I got a speeding ticket because I was so excited and so focused on the area that I didn't realize that I was speeding, and I got pulled over, got a citation, but I was in the moment, so. Okay, so the sightings of the big bird may have actually started up near Corpus Christi in Robstown at the end of 1975. But the first notable big bird encounter happened on January 1st, 1976. Two young girls in Harlingen, Jackie Davies and Tracy Lawson, were out playing in their yard, and they claimed they saw this 5-foot-tall, ugly bird with glowing red eyes staring at them. And of course, this freaked them out. It was out in their yard. And they went inside and tried to wake up their parents, but you know, it's New Year's morning. Parents probably partied pretty hard the night before. They didn't want to hear anything about it. But later that day, the father went outside and found some giant footprints, tracks in the yard that were, you know, like 12 inches long, these huge bird-like footprints. And local news stations got a hold of this, and there's I don't know if in McAllen, do we still have KRIO, as a TV station that was local to McAllen. They came out and did a news story and filmed the footprints. Unfortunately, that footage is long gone. I've tried to track it down, but they never digitized a lot of this old footage from the 70s. Unless someone has it recorded on a VHS tape somewhere, we may have lost that. So that was the first sighting, but it made a lot of news because of the footprints and the news story that ran locally. But then the next incident, which was pretty exciting and scary, happened on January 7th, the evening of January 7th, 1976 in Brownsville. There was a gentleman named Alberto Guajardo. Am I blocking the screen over here, by the way? I hope you guys can see this okay. I'll move around, it's kind of a gentleman named Alberto Guajardo was in his mobile home, and suddenly he heard something big and heavy slam against the wall on the outside. And he didn't have a gun, but he got a knife, and he went outside because he thought, you know, maybe someone's messing with me. And he didn't see anything at first, so he got in his car and turned on his headlights, and suddenly illuminated in his headlights, he saw this giant, ugly bird. And his exact quote was, "It looked like a bird, but not a bird. It was not from this earth." That's exactly what he said to George Cox of the Brownsville Herald that interviewed him, and who determined that he was pretty freaked out by this incident. But according to Alberto, he stood out there looking at this bird-like creature. It was making this pulsing noise, he said, in its throat. And after several minutes, it didn't fly away. According to him, it just kind of backed into the darkness and disappeared. But that made the headlines in the Brownsville Herald and some other local newspapers. These are both articles: big brown bird, big eyes, and so forth. So again, this is kind of like, now we're getting some traction here, right? Now people around the valley are starting to hear about this big bird was sighted. There was also an incident around this time where 2 police officers in San Benito claimed that they saw it one night on patrol. And they described it as a giant white bird, which doesn't really fit the paradigm. Most people said it was black or brown, but they claimed they had a sighting as well. I forgot my clicker. Okay, but the most dramatic incident by far happened on the evening of January 14th, 1976, when a gentleman in Raymondville named Armando Grimaldo was out smoking a cigarette on his porch, and he claimed he heard a noise like wind or flapping, and when he looked up, this giant bird-like creature was descending on top of him. And he began to run, and he claimed that this thing landed on him and basically scratched and tore his clothing, and he dove onto his belly into some bushes, and it flew away. And Armando was so in distress that he actually was rushed to the Willacy County Hospital in a state of shock. And so this was really the lightning bolt that really set the whole thing ablaze in terms of when this story hit the newspapers about someone actually being physically attacked by this giant winged creature. And according to him, it did have wings, it had kind of a leathery texture, and he said that it had a face that was almost like a cat or a monkey or a bat. It wasn't really a beaked-winged animal. So again, something unusual, but we're not exactly sure. Okay, so that's when the firestorm hit. And so for about 2 or 3 weeks throughout the valley, and you know, really up through South Texas and San Antonio where I live, there were a number of newspaper stories on a daily basis. The television station I referenced earlier, KRIO in McAllen, put out a $1,000 reward for the big bird's capture or killing. Local wildlife officials were aghast and came out and said, oh no, we don't want anyone killing big birds, because we have a lot of migratory birds here in the valley that are very important. But there were big bird hunters and investigators. People were out, beating the bushes. There were a number of other sightings all over the region. San Benito, Brownsville, of course, I mentioned, McAllen in Edinburg, Velasco, Omito, all the way as far west as Laredo. People were claiming to see this giant winged creature for about a 2 or 3 week period. Up near Poteet is probably the farthest north that it went at that point. So there was a lot of speculation, of course, what could this thing be? They went to I'm actually a volunteer educator at the San Antonio Zoo, if any of you guys have ever been to the San Antonio Zoo, and they got the zoo involved. They were going to the director at that time, a guy named Louis Di Sabato, and saying, what is this big bird? And Louis said, well, nothing like that should exist, because people were describing a wingspan of at least 10 feet across. He said, nothing like that exists in modern Texas, but if anyone gets it, we'll take it at the San Antonio Zoo. So we'll take 2 of those. More newspaper articles from that time. And again, even though the name Big Bird was out there, a lot of people were describing something that had kind of a leathery texture, bat-like wings, and sort of pterosaurian features. And again, I should underline, if you guys know, that pterosaurs were not dinosaurs per se, but they were related to dinosaurs. They were archosaurs, and they were sort of prehistoric flying reptiles, but they disappeared from the fossil record about 65 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous. So there's no evidence that pterosaurs survived beyond 65 million years ago. So in that respect, they are dinosaur-like. There's no indication that they've continued on past that time period. Now, there were some other weird aspects to the Big Bird mystery, other than just a big winged creature. If any of you folks are familiar with the case of the so-called Mothman from Point Pleasant, West Virginia, that case not only involved a really strange creature, but there were also a number of UFO sightings around that time in an area over called the TNT plant. There were encounters with mysterious men in black who would come and silence eyewitnesses of the Mothman and threaten them. So you got a little bit of that in terms of the Big Bird as well. For example, on the evening of January 3rd, just a couple days after the first notable sighting here in the valley, several people in San Benito claimed they saw a UFO hovering over San Benito that ultimately submerged and disappeared in this Resaca del Palma in San Benito. And so you had kind of an interesting, it was like the whole valley went nuts. You had this weird winged creature that was flying around. People were seeing UFOs. No Men in Black accounts yet that I've been able to encounter, but there were a lot of cattle and livestock mutilations happening at that time. And those actually predated the Big Bird sightings. At the latter part of 1975, there were some cattle and goats and other farm animals that were found mutilated in the areas in and around Brownsville and other parts of the valley. So here's an example of a newspaper article about a cattle mutilation. They said it may have been the work of a human. There was a lot of speculation going on. But I received this in 2004, I received this interesting email from a woman named Mary Mueller from the valley. And as you can see, she says she remembered that the Big Bird, she remembers the Big Bird story from that time, had connotations of Men in Black, government conspiracies, cattle mutilations. So people that were around, that time period, 1976 in the valley, remembered a lot of weird stuff going on. Not just the Big Bird, but the UFOs, the cattle mutilations. So there's kind of a similarity in terms of the Mothman cases and incidents of 1966, 67, when you had just like this, all of this high strangeness going on at the same time. And there was even a hit song composed and recorded by local musician Wally the Taco Kid Gonzalez. I don't know if any of you guys heard of that, but he capitalized on the Big Bird story and wrote a song called La Leyenda del Pájaro Grande, and it's a charming little Tejano song that you can find probably out on YouTube or something. So this is kind of the cover art from his album of that time, his LP. He was from the Valley as well. Gotta love the Taco Kid. And then the most notable incident, this was kind of the end of the Big Bird flap of 76, actually occurred in San Antonio, or on the south side of San Antonio. As I mentioned, there were sightings as far north as Poteet, up until that point at a ranch near Poteet. But on February 24th, 1976, is anyone from San Antonio? You guys know the south side? Okay. There were 3 school teachers, Patricia Bryant, Marcia Dahlberg, and David Rendon, were on their way to work. They were school teachers. They were in separate cars, headed to Southside High School in the morning, and they claimed they saw these 2 giant birds with 20-foot, what they estimated to be 20-foot wingspans hovering over a cow pasture and some cattle. And these teachers were actually so amazed that they pulled their cars over to the side of the road, got out to look at these 2 giant, I don't know if I would have done that. But they saw these 2 giant bird-like creatures, and then they made it to high school, and they weren't exactly sure what they had seen, so they started going through some textbooks and encyclopedias, and what they determined was that they had seen what they considered to be pterodactyls, which are giant, of course, the largest pterodactyls. By the way, the largest pterodactyl, the fossil remains have been found in West Texas in Big Bend National Park. It's a species called Quetzalcoatlus northropii. It had a wingspan of about 40 feet. So it was the largest winged creature to ever fly on the planet. It was in West Texas. Now at that time, Texas was this giant shallow ocean of the Cretaceous. So these were aquatic, or not aquatic, but they were birds that fed on aquatic life. They lived near the water. These newspaper articles appeared in the San Antonio Light and San Antonio Express News newspapers a couple of days after the incident, and lo and behold, the Southside School District Council basically silenced the teachers and told them to stop talking about these giant birds because you're freaking out the students here at Southside High School. Now, subsequently through the years, I've made contact with 2 other corroborating eyewitnesses of this incident. There was a woman named Lillian Munyin who grew up just near Southside High School, and she told me that on the same day, February 24, 76, in the morning, she saw these 2 giant birds flying over her yard, and she was very close by. And then in 2009, I was contacted by a woman named Blanca Trevino who works near this area on the south side, and she was leaving work one day, and she said her pickup truck was dive bombed by this hideous-looking giant winged creature, and basically put her into a state of shock. So there have been other sightings around the south side of San Antonio. I've interviewed dozens of witnesses that claim that they've seen these things. I've interviewed some of the original witnesses from the Valley. I've also interviewed people in San Antonio. The most recent sightings are 2016 up in near New Braunfels. There was a gentleman that was walking his dog that saw this giant bird. This is the location where the school teachers, do I get a laser? Come on, man, we're gonna have a UFO conference with no lasers? What's going on here? But you can see some cattle kind of over here, so it probably hasn't changed much. You know, there was a little kid that came up to I did an event last weekend, and he said, "You know why those giant birds were circling over the cattle?" I said, "Why?" He said, "They were gonna eat them." There you go, that's a future investigator right there. I like that theory. Okay, so when I began my investigation in 2003, 2004, I had a name of a young man from San Benito named Guadalupe Cantu that had been investigating the big bird back in the 70s as a young man. And lo and behold, when I got to San Benito, I tracked him down. And this is Guadalupe. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years after we began to correspond. But for a few years there, early on, and yeah, this is obviously pre-hat also, if you guys have followed the history of Ken Gerhard, this was right before that, the hat acquisition. But Guadalupe, he he was investigating the big bird for many years. He claims he finally did have a sighting. I think it was like in the 1990s, up in near Rangerville. He had a newspaper out in the morning, and he claimed he finally saw the big bird at that time. But he did collect a lot of accounts from this neighborhood. Now, there's a neighborhood in San Benito called La Colonia, and it's kind of an old traditional neighborhood, lots of old houses, and apparently the big bird was seen quite a lot in this particular area for years. And the sightings, according to Guadalupe, went back to the 1950s. There was a woman that was going out, an older lady was going out to her outhouse one night that claimed that she was attacked by the big bird. And this was well known throughout the neighborhood. So for whatever reason, and George Cox and some of the reporters that were investigating Big Bird in 1976 also heard that San Benito seemed to be the sort of the nexus point or ground zero for Big Bird reports. They think the Big Bird may have been nesting in this particular area. But unfortunately, like I said, Guadalupe, he did appear with me on an episode of Monster Quest. If you guys go back and watch the old Monster Quest episodes, we did an episode called Birdzilla, and Guadalupe appeared and did his testimony on that particular show. He also allowed me for a year, because he said that Big Bird was still in the neighborhood sometimes. I hung a trail camera on the roof of his house, so it was about 20 feet off the ground, pointing out across the street and across the neighborhood where he claimed that the big bird had been seen. And then a year later, I came and took the trail camera down and looked at the photos, and basically all I got were like the tops of some tall trucks that had gone through the neighborhood. That was the only thing that triggered the camera, so I didn't get any photographic evidence, unfortunately. Here I am, 2000, so now I got the hat. See, this is 2004. Brand new hat, and I'm at, this is a place called Squinny Switch, which is up near Corpus Christi in Robstown, where there were sightings of the big bird going, and I was investigating an old sighting from the 1950s. A guy that was out there fishing at Squinny Switch claimed that he saw this winged creature that, he couldn't identify, so. And this is a pretty nifty map that shows many of the big bird sightings. And of course, there's probably more in the valley than we can fit down there. But Big Bird has been reported all over Texas. I already mentioned sightings around Houston, San Antonio, Corpus Christi and Robstown, throughout the valley in Laredo. And you guys know Rio Grande City. There were sightings of a winged creature there at one point. Yeah, so, this is completely subjective, but, it almost appears to be somewhat of a migration pattern, doesn't it? Any of you guys are birders and you follow migration routes and stuff, and that's kind of interesting. And I actually, in my apartment, I have a full-size map of the United States with all of the winged cryptid reports, and you can actually see clusters and sort of seemingly migration patterns. So again, it's all speculation. But if these things are actual animals, prehistoric or whatever, however you want to perceive them, it would make sense that they would have, like all living creatures, migration patterns in different places they wanted to travel and go. So the notion of living pterosaurs seems highly improbable, and I'm telling you guys, as an investigator, I like to be as objective, and I'm actually very skeptical when it comes to a lot of claims. I certainly don't believe everything I hear, and I like to question and challenge. But there are accounts of living pterosaurs outside of Texas. And for example, in 1971, there was a Marine stationed at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, named Erskine Kuhn, who was on sentry duty. And he claimed that these two pterodactyls, or pterosaurs, and again, we see the familiar Rhamphorhynchus tail, right? The long tail with the flange shape on the end. He claimed that and this is his sketch. Erskine, I guess, was a pretty good artist, and so he did this particular sketch of these two. Now, one curious thing I should point about, I don't know if any of you guys are paleo geeks or paleontology nerds like me, but the Rhamphorhynchoids, the smaller pterosaurs, they did have this long tail, but they typically didn't have this long head crest. That is a diagnostic characteristic of the later pterodactyls that came at the end of the Cretaceous that were really big. They had this big crest on their head. Paleontologists speculate that they used it like a rudder when they were flying, kind of help them kind of get their guidance and stuff. And by the way, even though these pterosaurs were massive, these 40-foot wingspans, they were very lightweight. You know, like birds, they had hollow bones. They were like basically like giant kites. So the notion of them swooping down and picking up people, and by the way, that's the one thing in Jurassic World that really gets me, because when the pterodactyls are coming down and picking people up, it's like, they couldn't do that. There's no way they could pick up a person, but I digress. There are also traditions of living pterosaurs in parts of the world where we would really expect to find them. For example, in Africa, there's something called the Kangamato. And the Kangamato is basically described like either a giant bat, or people, the local natives say that it has kind of a look like a pterosaur. And the stories are very old, but as recently as the 1950s, there was a gentleman named J.P.F. Brown who claimed that he saw these two pterosaur-like creatures deep in the heart of Africa. There were also sightings in the nation of Namibia on the west coast, more recently than that. And probably even more famous than the African Kangamato is something called the Robin, or Dua, or Indaba bird of New Guinea, Papua New Guinea. And to this day, there are researchers that I know that are going over to Papua New Guinea and investigating these stories of pterosaurian-like winged creatures. Now, we certainly, if you guys know anything about Papua New Guinea, I mean, that is, you know, one of the least explored places on the planet. New species are being identified there all the time. It's very challenging habitat to get to. And so, as improbable as the concept of living pterosaurs might seem, it's a little bit more palatable to me to conceive of something like that in the deep jungles of Papua New Guinea and Africa as opposed to South Texas. But again, I've interviewed many people who swear that they've seen these things, and some of those folks are fairly skilled in terms of wildlife observation, outdoorsmen, hunters, ranchers, people that see a lot of different types of birds. Now, there's also a famous story talking about pterosaurs in North America. And by the way, the photo here is a hoax, so don't get too excited too fast. But back in 1890, there was an article that appeared in the Tombstone, Arizona Epitaph newspaper that talked about some cowboys that shot a giant winged monster in the Huacheca Desert, Whetstone Mountains. And according to the newspaper article and stories in cryptozoological literature, the cowboys took this giant winged creature and stretched its wings out in front of a barn and took a photo. And so this photo, it's known as the Thunderbird photo, is actually more mysterious perhaps than living pterosaurs, because many researchers have claimed that they've seen this photo as recently as the 1970s, but nobody can produce a copy of it now. So if you guys know, like John Keel, the author of Mothman Prophecies, claimed he saw it back in the day. There are claims that it appeared on a Canadian television show with some researchers there. But there are a number of hoaxed versions or recreations of this quote-unquote Thunderbird photo. So if you go online and Google it, you'll see one with Civil War soldiers and lumberjacks, and so a lot of people have tried to recreate this, but this is not the original photo, it's just a hoaxed recreation. But again, we do have a tradition of living pterosaurs in Arizona, southern Arizona from the 1890s. They basically said it looked like an alligator with giant leathery wings. There's the Jersey Devil. You guys are probably the Leeds Devil from New Jersey. People, different, it's a chimera. So the Jersey Devil, a famous cryptid, a lot of people describe it in different ways, but the most famous account of the Jersey Devil occurred in 1909, January 19th, 1909, and the Nelson Evans family saw this thing prancing around on their shed one night, and they said it had these leathery bat-like wings, and look at the tail. This is the tail they described. It kind of looks like a Rhamphorhynchus, right? So living pterosaurs, I don't know. Not the most probable cryptid in my own opinion, but there are new things being discovered all the time. So we certainly can't totally discount the possibility that, what I'm saying is it's not totally impossible. It's highly improbable, but it's totally impossible. It's not totally impossible that we have somewhere on the planet some remote population of these pterosaurs. Now, people often ask me, well, if these things exist in South Texas, where are they? Well, you know, why aren't they being seen more often? Why can't we find them? Well, the most palpable theory, in my own opinion, is that if these creatures exist, they actually live in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico, which is a pretty remote area. And I've been down there, I've done research in La Huasteca, south of Monterrey, and you get into the Sierra Madres and there's like no one out there. And isn't it interesting that at some Maya ruins in the Maya ruins of Tajín near Veracruz, there's actually engraved on one of the old stone structures there is something that looks like a pterosaur. So at one time I was corresponding with a cryptozoologist named Richard Greenwell from Arizona. Sadly, he passed away years ago, but he was at the Arizona State University, and you know, I reached out to him when I began my big bird research, and I said, you know, do you know anything about this, this engraving at these Maya ruins of Tajín? And he said, yes, and actually I have a contact in Mexico who tells me that there is a group of living pterosaurs there on the Gulf Coast of eastern Mexico near Veracruz. So again, all wild supposition, but if these things exist, you know, maybe they live in those remote mountains of Mexico, and we see them occasionally when they come up here into Texas. Now, we can take another direction with this, which many of you will probably be very welcome to, which is, and guys, like I said, I'm a curious person, I'm open-minded, but, you know, people certainly like to speculate about interdimensional travel, time travel. Are these things coming from the past? Are they coming from another reality or dimension? All of that's kind of outside of my wheelhouse, so I'm not going to speculate too heavily on that. But you guys are welcome to have any type of idea or thought or concept as far as where these winged creatures like Big Bird are coming from. There's no physical evidence. No one has found any physical evidence. There's no real good photographic evidence. In fact, there are drones now that look like pterodactyls that people have filmed in different places. So if you see something that looks like a pterodactyl flying around, it could very well just be a mechanical drone. So we have to keep that in mind as well. Now, that said, there are a number of possibilities in terms of misidentifications, and I'm just going to wrap up my lecture here by talking about some of the potential misidentifications. I've got 7 minutes. Good. So most cryptids, things like Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, the Chupacabra, most of those, in my own opinion, are what we refer to as cases of composite identity. What that means is that you have a lot of different creatures or things that are kind of being called the same thing or lumped together. That happens a lot with most of these cases, particularly when you have mass hysteria. So imagine when people first began to encounter the Big Bird in 1976, one guy, Armando Grimaldo, got attacked on January 14th. Now everyone's seeing Big Bird. You know, it's like, oh no, so people are looking up, they're looking at the skies. Here's another kind of recurring thing, guys, keep watching the skies. That's what I tell people all the time. How much time do we spend looking up these days? Probably more so in the past. These days, everyone's focus is right here. So there could be a pterodactyl or a big bird flying right over your head, or a UFO, and you might not see it. But anyways, I digress. So these are birds that are native to the Rio Grande Valley at different times. And you guys can help me out by raising your hands if you guys have ever seen one of these birds. This is a great horned owl. Yeah, thank you. Latin name, Bobo virginianus. It's the largest owl species in North America. And they do sometimes fly to the valley, and I would be remiss if I also didn't mention the local legend of La Chusa. And I'm sure many of you have heard of La Chusa in Mexico and Texas, which there are different interpretations, but La Chusa is a witch that is a shapeshifter that turns into a great bird with an ugly witch's head, or usually more typically an owl or a white owl. And you guys know, if La Chusa whistles at you, you're not supposed to answer her, right? Because that's bad juju. But as scary as great horned owls can be when you're driving down a dark road at night and one takes off, they only have a wingspan of about 4.5 to 5 feet across. So they're big birds and they can be startling, but they're certainly not approaching anything in terms of the size reported with the big bird. They do have large eyes and perhaps a cat-like or monkey-like face, if you want to interpret it as such. And we should also point out that Mothman has also been linked to big owls. Some people think the Mothman may have something to do with big owls. Owls have, in different cultures, not only La Trusa, but in other cultures, owls are considered to be bad omens. If there's an owl outside your window, it means someone's going to get sick or die or whatever. So owls get a bad rap, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I love owls personally. They're some of my favorite animals. Anybody seen one of these? Turkey vulture?
Those are cool.
You probably saw one today. They're very common.
Those are cool.
Latin name Cathartos aura. I see turkey vultures every day. One of the skeptical arguments about winged cryptids is that, oh, people are seeing turkey vultures. And I'm like, give me a break. I see turkey vultures every single day. They're big. They can have a wingspan. The really big turkey vultures can have a wingspan of about 6 feet across. But we're still not in the 10-foot to 15-foot neighborhood. And obviously, and also look at the coloration patterns, guys. People describe the big bird and other winged cryptids like thunderbirds as having a solid dark color, black, brown, or gray. This bird has got, owls have a very colorful pelage, so do turkey vultures have the diagnostic white fringe and of course the orange head. Anyone see one of these in the valley? Great blue heron, Latin name Ardea aerodias. They're magnificent birds. They're beautiful. They have a wingspan up to 6.5 feet across, 6.5 feet across, but they're fairly common, especially if you're down by the water, and they don't approach or look like what people were describing in terms of the big bird, in my opinion. Although, again, composite identity. Maybe right after Big Bird hit the newspaper, some people saw some owls and some turkey vultures and herons and thought, oh, I just saw the big bird. Maybe a little less common in the valley. Has anyone seen a golden eagle? Okay, Aquila chrysatos. It has a wingspan of up to 7.5 feet across. They can pick up small animals, but they only weigh about 25 pounds, but they are bigger than bald eagles, by the way. And eagles are accipterids, or birds of prey. They are sexually dimorphic, and the females are larger than the males. So a female golden eagle can have a 7.5 foot wingspan. Still should be identifiable to most people as an eagle. You saw this flying around and say, okay, that's a darn big eagle.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they're pretty.
Pelicans, you guys have pelicans down here? Pelicanus erythrorhynchus. They can have a wingspan up to 10 feet. Pelicans can get darn big, and they do look kind of prehistoric and almost like a pterosaur, but everyone knows what a pelican looks like, and they have, typically they're brown pelicans or white pelicans, and they have very colorful, bright plumage. And then here's one that's kind of rare. Has anyone seen one of these down here in the valley? Okay, these are migratory birds. They typically live in Central America. I actually encountered one of these one time at a resaca down here, and it scared the crap out of me. This is called a Jabari Stork. And these do come through the valley a couple times a year. They're migratory birds. They have a wingspan up to 8 feet across. They're very tall, and they do have kind of a prehistoric looking head, but they are very colorful. They have a blue head and neck, white feather, black feathers, but maybe some people were seeing these back in the day. And then finally, the largest, I know you guys, if you saw one of these, I'd be really surprised, but this is the California condor. Gymnogypes californianus, the largest bird in North America. It can have a wingspan of 9.5 to 10 feet across, but there are only a few hundred of these birds in existence, and most of them are closely monitored. You can see the tags here on the wings, and they are endemic to Southern California, Baja California, and they're now in the Grand Canyon and parts of southern Utah. But it would be very unlikely for a great California condor to be here. And then finally, there's a theory that maybe the big bird was something invasive, something that shouldn't have been here in the valley. So for example, here's an African marabou stork. Now, there are different ranches here in South Texas where people will have exotic animals, right? And sometimes those exotic animals may escape I've investigated cases of escaped hyenas and other animals running around South Texas, so that does happen. So maybe the big bird was something, you know, from another continent or whatever, but to this day we'll never really know. But anyways, that's my time for today. I do appreciate you guys. You've been great. I've got a table out here. If you have any questions, comments, opinions, or anything at all, feel free to come by and talk to me. And I do have signed copies of Big Bird available if you guys want to read a little bit more. Thank you. Thank you guys.
If you liked this video, be sure to check out our other content and get connected on our page and social media sites. Every day, new discoveries are being made all across the world and beyond, so let's work together to find out what's next. And remember, we won't know if we don't go. I'll see you in the vortex.